The day began innocently enough, with Remy Thornfra trying to carve out a sliver of peace on the small wooden dock of Lakeside Estates, fishing with his daughter Solon in hopes that the rhythmic cast and reel might help her heal from the gaping wound left by the loss of her mother. But the stillness of the morning shattered when Karen Wellington, the perfectly coiffed, athleisure-wearing HOA president whose tablet seemed more like a weapon than a device, strode onto the scene and, in a tone dripping with condescension, slapped him verbally with a $500 fine for casting a line into a lake that was advertised as an amenity when he bought his home. For Solon, who had just caught a bluegill and smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks, the punishment landed like a cruel joke, and for Remy it lit a spark beneath the grief that months of loss had left smoldering. At first he complied outwardly, guiding his daughter home with a promise to make lunch and a calm remark that some people value rules over human kindness. But within hours he began digging through documents and realizing the HOA's claim to the lake was shakier than Karen projected. Conversations with neighbors produced alarming revelations. Merrick Henderson, a retired ethics attorney, and Samuel Washington, a retired banker, confirmed that the HOA didn't own the lake outright. It was leased from the original developers, Meridian, for a 30-year term that was about to expire, and whispers suggested Meridian was financially desperate enough to liquidate. From this seed, an understanding blossomed in Remy's venture capitalist mind. The lake was an asset, undervalued and misunderstood, exactly the kind of distressed deal he had built his fortune from. Meanwhile, Merrick and Samuel exposed deeper rot, sharing data that proved Karen's reign was less about community standards and more about targeting new residents, minorities, or anyone who dared oppose her, hammering them with violations until they sold at distressed prices, which her shell companies, Lakeside Holdings, Sierra Vista Properties, various pseudonyms, all funneled back to her real estate empire, conveniently scooped up. Every story sounded the same: bogus petty fines for mailbox color, lawn height, holiday lights, or noisy children, followed by forced sales that somehow fell into Wellington's grasp. This pattern revealed Karen not as an HOA busybody, but as a strategist, and now she was setting her sights on the crown jewel, the lake itself, with plans to restrict access, ban fishing, and eventually build exclusive luxury homes on the shoreline through her real estate business, not for the HOA but her own pockets. For Remy, who had come to Lakeside Estates seeking healing, not combat, the discovery hardened into resolve, especially when he realized Meridian's precarious balance sheets meant they were ripe for a buyout. Quietly, using an LLC to mask his identity, he offered $350,000 cash for the lake and secured an agreement in days, outbidding Karen and undermining her months of scheming. During these weeks, Karen had escalated harassment. Bogus violations multiplied against Remy and his allies. Surveillance obvious, children mocked at school as troublemaker families, all classic attempts to grind down resistance. But instead, her aggression swelled the underground coalition of residents united against her. When the deal closed, Remy sat back with calculations of timing. Karen was planning to unveil a grand lake vision, with renderings of luxury lounges and reduced water access at a gala party, rallying original homeowners for a special assessment. He kept his ownership secret until that fateful afternoon when residents, sipping wine over catered hors d'oeuvres, gathered in wide-eyed anticipation of their president's announcement. Calmly, with Merrick, Samuel, his attorney, and even a police officer as witness, Remy stepped forward, seized the microphone, and unveiled the deed. The lake was his, the HOA lease was terminated, and the crowd currently mingling lakeside were trespassers unless they departed within minutes. The silence that fell represented not just shock, but the unraveling of Karen's carefully spun illusion of control. From there, events snowballed. Karen attempted to sue, cases dismissed swiftly under clear deed law. She attempted smear campaigns, undermined by her own hypocrisy leaking through social media. She attempted even sabotage, caught on camera sneaking bottles of contaminants to the shoreline in a desperate bid to paint Remy as polluter, which backfired into criminal trespassing charges. Meanwhile, Remy used not just the water but his financial expertise as weapons. He quietly bought mortgage notes on 20% of homes in the community, including Karen's, and offered refinancing at fair rates to everyone except current HOA leaders, leveraging goodwill with residents while cornering the board. Families once deferential to Karen now begged for their children to join Solon in Remy's new free fishing classes. Programs intentionally barred to board members' families until resignation. One by one, her allies cracked, resignations rippled, the board collapsed, and the audits revealed misappropriations, favoritism, and years of self-dealing. Within months, Karen was ousted, disgraced, her real estate empire collapsing under debt, while Remy announced he would transfer Rachel's lake, renamed for his late wife, into a permanent community trust on 3 conditions: transparent HOA reform, independent ethics oversight, and perpetual community access guaranteed by deed, ensuring no dictator could weaponize rules again. The story, which had begun with a grieving father fined $500 for teaching his daughter to fish, ended with a community restructured, a tyrant toppled, and a lake secured forever, symbolizing not revenge but resilience. Sitting on the dock months later during the first community fishing day, Solon's smile real and whole, Remy realized the paradox. The day he became the neighborhood's most hated man was also the day he became its most powerful. Not by force, but by patience, strategy, and the kind of leverage no bully could withstand. Truth written plainly on a deed and the will to use it justly. At the heart of the Lakeside Estates saga stand its sharply drawn characters, each embodying facets of power, resistance, greed, and renewal. And through them, the story becomes more than a fight over rules. It becomes an allegory of how personalities shape communities. The protagonist, Remy Thornfra, is a man forged by both privilege and tragic loss. A former venture capitalist who sold his stakes for millions and retired at 42, but whose greatest battle came from cancer stealing his wife and leaving him to raise his daughter Solon alone. Remy's role is that of reluctant warrior, not driven by ego but by grief transformed into fierce purpose. When Karen Wellington humiliates him for fishing with his daughter and slaps him with a $500 fine, she unwittingly awakens not just a wealthy neighbor, but a strategist who built his life around analyzing systems, identifying weaknesses, and dismantling obstacles with precision. His wealth becomes a quiet weapon, but his deeper strength lies in patience, foresight, and the resolve that his daughter should see him stand firmly against unfairness. In Solon, though not a combative player in the tale, we find the story's emotional compass and its symbolic soul. The 14-year-old, still reeling from her mother's death, finds her fragile joy in fishing, and the moment Karen cruelly interrupts that healing act, she becomes both the reason and the reward for Remy's crusade. Her tears on the dock transform her father's irritation into righteous anger, and later her smiles at the community fishing day become proof that victory meant more than toppling an oppressor. It meant restoring innocence where it had been trampled. Opposite him stands Karen Wellington, the antagonist whose character combines arrogance of power with desperation of debt, making her both tyrant and tragic cautionary tale. Impeccably dressed and wielding a tablet like an iron gavel, Karen embodies the pettiness of HOA authority elevated into dictatorship. Behind her community standards rhetoric lies personal ambition, quietly leveraging HOA control to acquire distressed properties through networks of shell companies. Her role is multi-layered. As queen bee drunk on bureaucracy, she enjoys selective punishment, singling out new residents and minorities while favoring allies. As real estate mogul on the brink of collapse, she lusts after the lake not for the HOA's benefit, but to salvage her empire through new luxury developments. And as manipulator, she enslaves the mayor, abuses board members with threats, and even trespasses at night, attempting sabotage when her schemes unravel. Karen is therefore more than a villain. She represents what happens when unchecked authority collides with greed, when someone confuses the HOA binder with divine law. If Remy is shaped by loss, Karen is shaped by fear of losing her status, wealth, and grip on the narrative, and her collapse is as much self-inflicted as it is engineered by others. Central to Remy's success are his unlikely allies, each playing vital roles as archetypes of wisdom and support. Merrick Henderson, the retired ethics lawyer, represents knowledge of law and the moral compass of the neighborhood. His archives of HOA abuses and his sharp legal insight help Remy see Karen's facade for what it is, while his steadfast refusal to be intimidated proves that principle, even retired, still matters. Beside him stands Samuel Washington, a retired banker, elegant and seasoned, who embodies resilience in the face of discrimination, having suffered firsthand from Karen's subtle prejudices. yet channeling that injustice into meticulous records of HOA misconduct. Together, Merrick and Samuel operate as Remy's counsel, his war room brains providing historical pattern and ethical clarity. Without them, his millions might have bought the lake but not the legitimacy of community reform. Adding to this cast is Robert Chen, the insider real estate broker who quietly supplies Remy with intel about Meridian's desperation and Karen's financial overreach, ensuring Remy strikes with perfect timing. Their roles matter less as plot devices and more as a symbolic chorus, the voices of truth that had gone unheard until someone with Remy's resources amplified them. Then there are the community residents. Minor players individually but powerful collectively, their stories forming the evidence of Karen's selective cruelty. Maria Gonzalez, whose foster children were denied pool access as too loud. James Morris fined for Christmas lights after criticizing Karen. Diana Winters humiliated by invasive backyard inspections. Sapphira Duskland, timid florist threatened with lease cancellation if she questioned HOA authority. These neighbors reflect the silent majority under Karen's thumb, each one bullied into keeping quiet until Remy's coalition reveals their strength in numbers. Their role is to act as the conscience of the community, showing that injustice goes unchallenged not because it is invisible, but because voices were too isolated until united. In their mounting testimonies and eventual courage to criticize Karen publicly, the story achieves its collective turn from grievance to reform. Even supporting characters reflect the broader web of corruption and justice. Mayor James Wilson, corruptly tied to Karen, symbolizes political rot infiltrating neighborhoods. Officer Reynolds, the neutral cop who calmly enforces trespassing law at Remy's reveal, symbolizes the return of real authority, and the attorneys, inspectors, and reporters filling the latter chapters reflect mechanisms of accountability. Taken together, these characters form not just a cast but an ecosystem of roles. Remy the strategist, Solon the symbolic heart, Karen the tyrant collapsing under greed, Merrick and Samuel the wise counselors, Robert Chen the informant, residents the chorus, and officials the enforcers of aftermath. Without each, the arc would not hold. Together they tell a story not just of one father toppling a petty HOA dictator, but of how grief, wealth, and solidarity aligned to turn the most hated man in Lakeside Estates into the man who redefined it. Seen through the legal and financial lens, the battle at Lakeside Estates becomes less about personalities and more about structures of power, contracts, deeds, and the cold logic of numbers that ultimately dismantled Karen Wellington's empire. From the very beginning, Karen weaponized the HOA covenant not as a neutral community framework, but as a cudgel, issuing selective fines and trumped-up violations for everything from mailbox colors to misplaced bicycles, confident that most residents lacked the knowledge, resources, or appetite for drawn-out legal disputes. Her tactics rested on intimidation and the presumption that the HOA's power was absolute, but legally her authority was more illusory than real. A crucial discovery highlighted by Merrick Henderson was that the lake, presented by Karen as property owned and ruled by the HOA, was in fact under lease from Meridian Development Corporation, and with the lease expiring imminently, the HOA's controlling power over the body of water was thin at best. Legally, the HOA had usage rights but not ownership, and when those rights lapsed, they could vanish entirely unless renewed by the property owner. Karen, savvy enough to know this but greedy enough to twist it for personal gain, began maneuvering to buy the lake through her private real estate company, rather than on behalf of the community, hoping that the aura of HOA authority would mask the reality that she alone stood to profit. Her deeper scheme involved shell companies, Lakeside Investments, Wellington Holdings, Sierra Vista Properties, all financial veils leading back to her, designed to separate her official duties as HOA president from her private ambition as a developer. This dual role exposed her legally to conflicts of interest, misrepresentation, selective enforcement, and potential fraud. Leveraging an HOA charter to depress property values, targeting minorities or dissenters until they sold under pressure, and then funneling those homes into her own pipeline of acquisition and resale. But where her legal shell game thrived on residents' ignorance of governance bylaws and property deeds, it faltered against someone like Remy Thornfra, who not only had the financial capital to compete, but the professional background to exploit distressed assets from the moment he learned that Meridian was eager to offload The lake and that Karen's offer was a shaky, financing-dependent proposal of $300,000 stretched over 18 months. Remy began treating the dispute nota sana exporhud quarrel buda sa corporat negotiation. His counteroffer, €300 stretched over 18 months. Remy began treating the dispute nota sana exporhud quarrel buda sa corporat negotiation. His counteroffer, $350, niloriwan. Cash closing within 7 days, was a decisive financial move grounded not in emotion but in leverage. By using a holding LLC, he concealed his identity while providing Meridian the certainty of liquidity it craved, and by doing so he outmaneuvered Karen legally, purchasing outright the very asset she had implicitly promised for the HOA. Once in possession, the legal tables turned completely. The HOA's regulations had applied only within the window of the lease agreement, and Remy, as new owner of the lake, had full discretion to terminate that lease on notice of their maintenance failures he had already documented by commissioning ecological reports, revealing high phosphates and algae growth ignored under Karen's watch. This gave him lawful reason to end HOA access immediately, and when he revealed ownership during the lakeside party, his presentation of the deed was not just symbolic but airtight. A stamped, recorded county record no board majority or mayoral ally could overrule. Karen's claims of community rights faltered against the simple reality of property law. Ownership outranks charismatic declarations, and expired leases cannot be resuscitated by passion or intimidation. Equally important were Remy's parallel financial counterattacks, which targeted the economic foundations of Karen's influence. He leveraged his contacts and Samuel Washington's banking expertise to quietly purchase mortgage notes on nearly 20% of the community's homes, with special focus on Karen's allies. While this move was aggressive, it was entirely legal. Debt obligations are transferable assets, and purchasing them gave him controlling influence over both Karen's own home and her supporters' leverage points. Where HOA fines had been her intimidation tactic, control of debt service became his. Unlike Karen, however, he wielded it benevolently, offering refinancing at lower interest rates to most residents, converting debt into goodwill, and further isolating the corrupt board. The legality here was key. He did not foreclose, extort, or manipulate, but instead used financial instruments within the rules, exposing how Karen had twisted rules for personal gain. When she attempted desperate measures, smearing him with further violations, attempting to bribe Merrick into scaring him with fabricated environmental liability, and finally committing criminal trespass by trying to tamper with lake waters, the contrast between lawful action and unlawful desperation became stark. Each misstep on her part compounded criminal and civil liability. Bribery recorded on tape exposed her to charges of corruption. Trespassing and environmental tampering covered her with criminal exposure. The misuse of HOA funds on pet projects raised potential misappropriation claims. And her years of selective enforcement created fertile grounds for class action discrimination lawsuits. Legally, her empire collapsed under the weight of cumulative infractions, while financially, her over-leveraged position meant she could not absorb the restitution and legal fees that followed. Remy's approach exemplified the marriage of legal patience and financial muscle.
He did not need to outshout Karen at HOA meetings.
Instead, he used due diligence, contracts, deeds, debt acquisitions, and bylaws to dismantle her credibility. The result was Karen's removal in criminal charges, the restructuring of the HOA with term limits and ethical oversight, and the transfer of the lake into a permanent trust with legally binding protections against abuse. Through this lens, the story is not simply about a neighborhood feud, but about the supremacy of clearly defined property rights, the financial vulnerability of over-leveraged corruption, and the victory of methodical legal strategy. The lesson is clear. HOA intimidation, when unchecked, thrives in environments where residents don't know their rights. But when those rights are wielded with resources and precision, the law tilts decisively against the bully. When viewed through the thematic lens, the saga of Remy Thornfra's collision with Karen Wellington at Lakeside Estates emerges not just as another story of HOA harassment and neighborhood politics, but as an allegory about the clash of grief, power, legitimacy, and reform, layered with meaning far beyond fishing bans or violation notices. At its core lies the universal theme of power versus legitimacy. Karen represents the intoxicating abuse of structural power with no lawful foundation, wielding HOA bylaws and a board stacked with allies as though they were imperial decrees, selectively applying them to humiliate, drive out, or exploit residents. While Remy represents authentic legitimacy, the calm deployment of actual property rights, deeds, environmental tests, and financial leverage. This confrontation reminds us that paper fines and smug tablets mean nothing when compared to stamped deeds recorded at the county, just as posturing collapses under the weight of ownership. Karen thrives on bluster, intimidation, and displays of superiority. But the moment Remy holds the microphone at her party and presents a legal deed of private ownership, the power dynamic flips instantly, embodying the greater truth that authority only endures when tethered to legitimacy. Closely tied to this is the theme of grief versus healing, for the entire story is motivated not by ego, but by Remy's desire to protect a fragile bond with his daughter, Solon, who finds her only respite from mourning her mother in the simple act of fishing at the community lake. Karen's cruel interruption of that healing morning sets off the chain of events, and symbolically, the lake takes on the role of a sanctuary invaded. Each of Remy's strategic moves, buying the lake, standing firm against fines, restructuring the community, feels less like business and more like an extended defense of sacred ground where a father and daughter reclaim joy after loss, turning a petty $500 fine into a battle over dignity, memory, and the right to mourn without interference. The story evolves into a meditation on how personal wounds can ignite social change, showing that sometimes those fighting corruption are not motivated by money or revenge, but by living reminders of love lost. Another profound theme is tyranny versus reform. Karen's 8-year grip on the HOA symbolizes how unchecked power corrodes communities. She creates a two-tier system of fear and favoritism, punishing minorities and newcomers disproportionately, rewarding cronies with selective lenience, and using intimidation to silence critics. This dictatorship in miniature exposes how small authorities, once left unchallenged, mirror larger systems of oppression. Against this backdrop, Remy and his allies form an underground coalition that mirrors revolutionary cells in larger political contexts. Neighbors meeting in secret, gathering documentation, protecting one another from retaliation, and strategically waiting until Lady Dictator exposes herself too flagrantly to be defended. The thematic climax comes not when Karen is sued or investigated, but when residents, inspired by Sapphira Duskland's timid courage, begin speaking openly of abuses at HOA meetings. That moment reflects the theme of how tyranny collapses, not by one man's deed alone, but by many voices reclaiming their right to be heard. Out of this confrontation emerges reform, embodied not simply in Karen's expulsion, but in the new governance model created: term limits, financial transparency, and an independent ethics committee. This trajectory transforms what began as isolated resistance into collective renewal, showing that the end goal of fighting tyranny should never be personal dominance, but systemic repair. Meanwhile, the theme of community versus isolation is woven through every subplot. Under Karen, residents learn to isolate themselves, afraid to speak up, afraid to gather, afraid to resist fines lest they be targeted more viciously. Families suffer alone, convinced their violations are unique failures until Merrick and Samuel help expose the shared pattern of injustice. The turning point thematically is when Remy's resistance unifies the silos, when Maria, James, Diana, and others realize their stories echo one another. Community is restored when secrecy transforms into collective trust, and later when families gather freely at Rachel's Lake, fishing and laughing together without fear. The theme underscores how oppression thrives in silence but collapses under solidarity, reminding us that strength lies not in avoiding conflict, but in facing it together. Finally, we encounter the theme of resilience versus corruption, Karen's desperate late-night attempts to tamper with water, her bribes to Merrick, her misuse of HOA funds, and her carefully maintained facade of wealth all reveal corruption as both systemic and personal, born of over-leverage and fear of collapse. Remy, conversely, represents resilience. He absorbs waves of harassment, bogus citations, even schoolyard stigma aimed at his daughter, yet he refuses to yield or leave. His resilience is strategic, not blind. He redirects his business acumen into buying mortgage notes, thereby turning Karen's game of fear into an instrument of justice, offering residents relief rather than escalation. Symbolically, the renaming of the lake to Rachel's Lake signals victory of resilience over corruption, turning water once weaponized by a dictator into legacy water, preserving love and memory. Thus, the themes of power versus legitimacy, grief versus healing, tyranny versus reform, community versus isolation, and resilience versus corruption together transform this HOA story into more than neighborhood drama. They turn it into a parable about human dignity, systems of control, and the inevitability of justice when patient resilience meets illegitimate power. Ultimately, the lake is not just water. It is a mirror reflecting human choices, showing how small bodies of land can carry large lessons about life, authority, and redemption. If you clicked on this story just for entertainment during a dull HOA meeting, or while hiding in your car, you're about to hear how one father turned a $500 fishing fine into the complete downfall of a community dictator, and why Lakeside Estates was never the same again. The hook was painfully simple. Remy Thornfra, a retired venture capitalist with more money than he needed but far less than he had lost. His wife, Rachel, taken by cancer, decided that fishing with his grieving daughter Solon was the only balm for their sorrow. But on their first peaceful Saturday morning at the lake, their fragile joy was shattered when Karen Wellington,
HOA president and self-proclaimed queen of civility,
marched down in designer sneakers and announced a $500 fine for the crime of placing a hook in the water. Right there, the conflict began. An elitist bully wielding rules like a sword against a man who just wanted to see his daughter smile. Most neighbors folded when faced with fines, but Karen had picked the wrong target, because Remy had 4 million reasons and a lifetime of business strategy behind him, and he wasn't about to let a tablet-wielding bureaucrat rewrite his family's healing narrative. Soon, the story unfolded like a slow-burn thriller. Remy made allies with Merrick Henderson, the retired ethics attorney, with Samuel Washington, the elegant ex-banker who had long tracked Karen's abuses, and with neighbors like Maria and James who whispered their stories of racial bias, petty violations, and intimidation tactics. He discovered that the lake wasn't owned by the HOA at all, but was still under the legal control of Meridian Development, set to expire in lease within months. Karen had been scheming through a web of shell companies to purchase the lake for herself, not the community, with plans to ban fishing permanently, build luxury lakefront homes, and cash out while hiding behind the illusion of HOA standards. But every great antagonist creates the stage for her own downfall, and Karen, drunk on her rule book and overextended with loans, couldn't see the trap being laid. The climax was perfectly timed. For weeks, Karen escalated harassment, piling violation after violation onto Remy's mailbox lawn, even his daughter's bicycle left outside for 15 minutes. Spreading rumors that the Thornfras were troublemakers lowering property values, and even colluding with her ally, the mayor, to push bogus safety inspections. This barrage of pressure was meant to force capitulation, but instead, behind the scenes, Remy set his pieces in place. Using his capital in discreet negotiations, he purchased the lake outright, $350,000 in cold cash delivered within 7 days, blowing Karen's financing scheme apart before she could close. He didn't announce it immediately. He waited for her to stage a lavish lakeside gala, complete with wine bars, catered trays, and architectural renderings of the glorious future she promised for her lake. That was the moment he stepped onto the stage. Standing at the microphone, flanked by Merrick, Samuel, and even a police officer, Remy presented the deed in front of 60 stunned neighbors, declaring that the lake was his. The HOA's lease was terminated, and that every guest at Karen's party was technically trespassing. Karen tried to bark back about community rights and lawsuit threats, but the microphone wasn't in her hands anymore, and behind Remy's calm smile was the full force of property law that no HOA bylaw could undo. The murmurs in the crowd felt cinematic. Anger at Karen, respect for Remy. Shocked that after all those years of her reign, the ultimate rulebook was a deed with someone else's name on it. The queen had been checkmated in her own ballroom. The aftermath was chaos for Karen. Watching her empire disintegrate, she careened from one desperate tactic to another, attempting to sue, dismissed immediately with the deed on record, spreading rumors that the lake was polluted, disproven by water quality tests Remy had commissioned, even sneaking onto his property at night to collect samples or sabotage the lake, only to be caught in high definition by Remy's security cameras. Each bungled attempt became evidence, trespassing, bribery attempts caught in Merrick's recordings, and misuse of HOA funds. Meanwhile, Remy turned financial screws of his own. He purchased mortgage notes on nearly 1/5 of community homes, including Karen's, and offered refinancing at lower rates to everyone except board members. Families once cowed into silence began lining up at his door, suddenly eager to leave Karen's sinking ship and join his programs, like his new initiative offering free fishing passes and ecology classes for children, but pointedly excluding children of current board members until their parents resigned. Social pressure flipped like a switch. Longtime allies of Karen resigned en masse. Residents voiced historical grievances publicly, and the HOA board collapsed under the weight of investigations, resignations, and community disgust. Karen, once queen of the lawns and mailboxes, now faced criminal trespass charges, misappropriation scrutiny, and a reputation so toxic she couldn't even sell her house. The resolution, however, was not purely vengeance. It was reform, healing, and legacy. Remy transferred ownership of the lake, now christened Rachel's Lake in honor of his late wife, into a permanent community trust with legal conditions, term limits for HOA leadership, mandatory financial audits, equal regulation enforcement, and an ethics committee drawn from ordinary residents. What began as one man versus a petty tyrant became a model of how neighborhoods could protect themselves from intimidation. On the 3-month anniversary of his deed reveal, families gathered for the first community fishing day, children laughing as they reeled in their first bluegills, parents chatting freely without fear of fines, and Solon smiling fully, whispering that her mother would be proud. For a man accused of being the troublemaker lowering property values, Remy had used strategy, law, and patience to become the most powerful man in Lakeside Estates, not by fear, but by restoring dignity. And as any good storyteller knows, that final wide shot, the lake at sunset, father and daughter side by side on the dock, HOA bullies gone quiet, delivers the catharsis. Not just a victory over corruption, but proof that sometimes the best revenge is reshaping the rules so bullies never rise again.